In 1874, an Army expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer discovered gold in the Black Hills, which are located in what is now South Dakota. At that time, the United States recognized the Black Hills as part of Sioux Nation territory, as stipulated in a treaty signed by both parties 6 years earlier. The Grant administration attempted to purchase the land, but the Sioux, who regarded the hills as sacred, declined to sell. In 1876, federal troops were sent to force the Sioux onto reservations and subdue the Great Plains. That June, Custer launched an assault on a Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho camp along the Little Bighorn River in present-day Montana. The Battle of the Little Bighorn is one of the most extensively analyzed events in U.S. military history, with a vast body of literature primarily focused on examining Custer's leadership during the battle. However, neither he nor the 209 soldiers under his direct command survived the conflict, and an Indian counteroffensive would trap 7 companies of their fellow 7th Cavalrymen on a hill over 4 miles away. Of the roughly 400 soldiers on the hilltop, 53 were killed and 60 wounded before the siege was lifted the following day. The details of Custer's and his men's experiences can only be reconstructed through inference. It was early morning, just as the sun was rising on Sunday, June 25, 1876, when men and boys began leading the horses out to graze. The first light of day was also the signal for the women to rekindle the cooking fires from the night before. Good White Buffalo Woman, a Hunkpapa woman, later recalled that she had been in many camps when war seemed imminent, but that morning felt different. The Sioux had no intention of fighting, she remembered. We did not expect an attack. Those who witnessed the gathered camp claimed they had never seen one of such size before. It had formed in March or April, even before the grass began to grow, as noted by the Oglala warrior, He-Dog. Native Americans arriving from far-off reservations along the Missouri River had reported that soldiers were coming to engage in battle, prompting the different camps to stay closely grouped together. There were at least 6, possibly 7, camps situated next to each other, with the Cheyennes at the northern or downriver end, near the wide crossing where Medicine Tail Coulee and Muskrat Creek flowed into the Little Bighorn River. Among the Sioux, the Hunkpapas were positioned at the southern end. Along the bends and loops of the river, the Sans Arc, Brûlé, Minneconjou, Santee, and Oglala camps were spread out. Some said the Oglala camp was the largest, followed by the Hunkpapas, with perhaps 700 lodges between them. The other groups might have numbered 500 to 600 lodges. This would suggest a total population of around 6,000 to 7,000 people, a third of whom were men or boys of military age. Adding to the complexity of estimating numbers was the ongoing arrival and departure of people from the reservations. These travelers, along with hunters from the camps, women collecting roots and herbs, and those searching for lost horses, formed part of an informal early warning system. There were many late risers this morning because the dances from the night before had lasted until dawn. A very large tent near the center of the village, likely 2 lodges built side by side, was filled with the elders, referred to as chiefs by the whites, but as short hairs, silent eaters, or big bellies by the Indians. As the morning grew hot and muggy, many adults and children went to swim in the river. The water was likely cold. Black Elk, who would later become the Oglala Holy Man and was 12 at the time, recalled that the river was high due to snowmelt from the mountains. It was close to mid-afternoon when a report came in that U.S. troops had been seen approaching the camp. "We could hardly believe that soldiers were so close," said the Oglala elder runs the enemy. It made no sense to him or the other men in the large lodge. For one thing, whites never attacked during the day. For a few more moments, runs the enemy remembered. "We sat there smoking." Subsequent reports followed. White Bull, a Minneconjou, was tending to horses near the camp when scouts arrived from Ash Creek with news that soldiers had shot and killed an Indian boy at the fork of the creek, about 2 or 3 miles away. Women who had been gathering turnips across the river several miles to the east came riding in, breathless, and reported that soldiers were approaching, as recounted by the Oglala chief Thunderbear. The land, they said, appeared to be filled with smoke, so much dust had been kicked up. The soldiers had shot and killed one of the women. Fast Horn, an Oglala, arrived to report that he had been shot at by soldiers he had seen near the high divide on the path into the Rosebud Valley. However, the first real alarm that prompted warriors to take action likely occurred at the Hunkpapa camp around 3 o'clock, when some horse thieves, Arikara, or Ree, Indians working for the soldiers, as it turned out, were spotted racing toward animals grazing in a ravine not far from the camp. Within moments, gunshots were heard at the southern end of the camp. Peace quickly turned to chaos. Shouts and cries from women and children, men calling for horses or weapons, boys dispatched to find their mothers or sisters, swimmers hurrying from the river, and men trying to organize resistance, preparing their weapons, painting their bodies, or tying up their horses' tails. As the warriors charged out to face the horse thieves, those at the southernmost edge of the Hunkpapa camp began shouting warnings upon spotting the approaching soldiers, who were first seen in a line on horseback about a mile or two away. By 3:10 or 3:15, the Indians had rushed from their lodges to confront them. At this point, the first shots echoed back to the council lodge, prompting Runs the Enemy to finally set aside his pipe. Bullets sounded like hail on teepees and treetops, recalled Little Soldier, a Hunkpapa warrior. Near the edge of the camp, the family of Chief Gall, his 2 wives and 3 children, were killed in a hail of gunfire as they stood near their lodge. Yet the Indians swiftly emerged and began shooting back, putting up enough of a defense to halt the attack. The white soldiers dismounted. Every 4th man took control of 3 extra horses, guiding them along with his own into the trees near the river. The remaining soldiers formed a skirmish line numbering perhaps 100 men. The entire event unfolded rapidly. As the Native Americans advanced to confront the skirmish line, directly ahead of them, the river lay to their left, hidden by dense woods and underbrush. On the right, open prairie stretched away to the west, and beyond the end of the line, a group of mounted Native Americans quickly gathered. These warriors were moving wide, circling around the end of the line. Among them were He-Dog and Braveheart, who rode further out, maneuvering around a small hill behind the soldiers. By this time, the soldiers had started to turn back to face the Native Americans behind them. Essentially, the line had stalled. The gunfire was intense and rapid, but the fast-moving warriors on their ponies were difficult to hit. More and more fighters rushed out to engage the soldiers, while women and children fled. Within just 15 to 20 minutes of the battle's start, the Native Americans were gaining the upper hand. The soldiers began retreating toward the trees along the river. The sequence of events at the Battle of the Little Bighorn was already clear. Intense skirmishes, rapid movements, close combat with men falling either dead or wounded, followed by brief intervals of calm as both sides regrouped, assessed the situation, and readied themselves for the next confrontation. As the soldiers vanished into the trees, individual Indians cautiously followed, while others assembled nearby. The gunfire slowed but never ceased. 2 major movements were occurring at once. Most of the women and children were heading north along the river, leaving the Hunkpapa camp behind, while an increasing number of men passed them on their way to the battle, where the action was happening, according to Eagle Elk, a close friend of Red Feather and Crazy Horse's brother-in-law. Crazy Horse himself, already highly regarded among the Oglala for his skill in battle, was approaching the fight around the same time. Crazy Horse had been swimming in the river with his companion Yellow Nose when they heard the gunfire. A short time later, without his horse, he encountered Red Feather, who was saddling his pony. "Take any horse," said Red Feather as he readied to charge off, but Crazy Horse waited for his own mount. Red Feather would not see him again until 10 or 15 minutes later, when the Indians had gathered in force near the woods where the soldiers had taken cover. It was likely during those moments that Crazy Horse readied himself for battle. Amid the urgency of the situation, many men grabbed their weapons and rushed toward the gunfire, but not all. War was too perilous to approach without care. A warrior needed to be properly adorned and painted before facing the enemy. Without his spiritual preparations and time for prayer or song, he would feel weak. A 17-year-old Oglala named Standing Bear stated that after the initial warnings, Crazy Horse called upon a Wicasa Wakan, medicine man, to summon the spirits, then took such a long time with his preparations that many of his warriors began to lose patience. 10 young men who had pledged to follow Crazy Horse anywhere in battle stood nearby. He sprinkled himself and his companions with a handful of dry earth, collected from a mound left by a mole or gopher, as a young Oglala named Spider recalled. Crazy Horse then braided some long grass stems into his hair, according to Spider. He next opened the medicine bag he wore around his neck, took a pinch of material from it, and burned it as an offering on a fire made of buffalo chips, which another warrior had set up. The smoke, he believed, carried his prayer to the heavens. Other accounts mention that Crazy Horse painted his face with spots resembling hail and dusted his horse with the dry earth. According to both Spider and Standing Bear, he was now ready for battle. By the time Crazy Horse reached his cousin Kicking Bear and Red Feather, it was difficult to spot the soldiers in the forest, but the gunfire was intense. Bullets rattled through the branches and sent leaves drifting down to the earth. Several Native Americans had already been killed, and others were injured. There was shouting and chanting. Some women who had stayed behind were making the high-pitched, wavering cry known as the tremolo. Ironhawk, a prominent member of Crazy Horse's Oglala group, said his aunt was encouraging the incoming warriors with a song. "Brothers-in-law, now your friends have arrived. Be brave. Do you want to see me taken prisoner?" At that moment, someone close to the trees shouted, "Crazy Horse is here!" From the Indians surrounding the soldiers' rear came the battle cry, "Hoka-hey!" Many of the warriors by the woods recalled that Crazy Horse repeatedly rode his pony past the soldiers, drawing their fire, a daring act sometimes called a brave run. Red Feather remembered that someone among the Indians shouted, "Clear the way, let the soldiers out, we can't reach them in there." Soon the soldiers emerged and attempted to head toward the river. As they rushed out of the forest, Crazy Horse called to the men near him, "Here are some of the soldiers after us again. Do your best, and let us destroy them today, so they will trouble us no more. Ready? Charge!" Crazy Horse and the others now urged their horses straight into the soldiers. "We rode right into their midst," said Thunder Bear, "shooting them down just like in a buffalo hunt." Horses were struck, and soldiers fell to the ground. A few managed to retreat behind others, but most were quickly slain while on foot. It was all chaos, said the Cheyenne 2 moons of the melee. Sioux, then soldiers, then more Sioux, all firing at once. Flying Hawk and Oglala explained how difficult it was to see clearly. "The dust was so thick we could hardly make out what was happening. We got right among the soldiers and killed many with our bows, arrows, and tomahawks. Crazy Horse led the charge, killing many with his war club." 2 moons described seeing soldiers fall into the riverbed like buffalo being chased. The Minneconjou warrior Red Horse stated that several soldiers drowned. Many of the Indians pursued the soldiers across the river and followed them as they fled up the bluffs toward a hill, now called Reno Hill, after the officer who commanded the soldiers. White Eagle, the son of Oglala Chief Horned Horse, was killed in the pursuit. A soldier paused long enough to scalp him, one swift cut with a sharp knife, followed by a tug on a clump of hair to tear the skin loose. The whites suffered the most. More than 30 were killed before reaching the top of the hill and dismounting to make a stand. Among the bodies of men and horses left on the flat land by the river below were 2 wounded Ree-scouts. The Oglala Red Hawk later remarked that the Indians who found the scouts said these Indians wanted to die. That was why they were scouting with the soldiers, so they killed them and scalped them. The soldiers' crossing of the river provided a temporary pause in the battle. Some of the Indians pursued them to the hilltop, but many others, like Black Elk, stayed behind to collect firearms and ammunition, strip the dead soldiers of their clothes, or round up runaway horses. Crazy Horse immediately turned back with his men toward the heart of the great camp. The only Indian to explain his sudden withdrawal was Gall, who speculated that Crazy Horse and Crow King, a prominent leader of the Hunkpapa, feared a second attack on the camp from the north. Gall said they had seen soldiers moving in that direction along the bluffs on the opposite side of the river. The skirmish along the river flat, from the first sighting of soldiers riding toward the Hunkpapa camp to the last of them crossing the river and making their way to the hilltop, had lasted about an hour. During this time, a second group of soldiers had appeared at least 3 times on the eastern heights above the river. The first sighting occurred only a minute or two after the first group began their ride toward the Hunkpapa camp, around 3:05 p.m. 10 minutes later, just before the first group formed a skirmish line, the second group was again spotted across the river, this time on the very hill where the first group would later take cover after their frantic retreat. At about 3:30 p.m., the second group was visible once more on a high point above the river, roughly halfway between Reno Hill and the Cheyenne village at the northern end of the large camp. By then, the first group was retreating into the timber. It is likely that the second group of soldiers had their first clear view of the expansive Indian camp from this high bluff, which would later be named Weir Point. The Yanktonese White Thunder reported that he observed the second group of soldiers move toward the river, south of the ford, near the Cheyenne camp, before they turned back upon reaching a steep cut bank they could not descend. While the soldiers retraced their steps, White Thunder and a few companions traveled eastward, climbing over the high ground to the other side, where they were quickly joined by many other Indians. In White Thunder's view, the second group of soldiers had effectively been surrounded before any fighting began. The distance from where the first group of soldiers retreated across the river to the next crossing at the northern end of the large camp was approximately 3 miles, a 20-minute ride. Between the two crossings, steep bluffs obstructed much of the river's eastern bank, but just beyond the Cheyenne camp was a clear stretch of several hundred yards, which later became known as Minneconjou Ford. Indians claimed that this was the closest the second group of soldiers came to the river and the Indian camp. However, according to most Indian accounts, it wasn't very close at all. Approaching the ford from the southeast, along a dry creek bed in a shallow ravine now called Medicine Tail Coulee, the exact timeline of events is hard to pinpoint. But it seems likely that the first sighting of soldiers at the upper end of Medicine Tail Coulee occurred around 4 o'clock, just as the first group of soldiers was scrambling up the bluffs toward Reno Hill and Crazy Horse, and his followers were retreating. 2 Moons, who was in the Cheyenne camp, saw soldiers coming over a ridge and descending toward the river. Gall and 3 other Indians were observing the same soldiers from a high point on the river's eastern side. 2 soldiers were far ahead of the others. 10 years later, Gall would identify these 2 soldiers as Custer and his orderly, but it's more likely that they were not. Gall recalled that the man he believed to be Custer was in no hurry. Off to Gall's right, on a bluff upriver, some Indians appeared as Custer and his group approached. Feather Earring, a Minneconjou, said that Indians were then arriving from the south on that side of the river in great numbers. When Custer saw them, Gall said, "His pace slowed, his actions became more cautious, and eventually he stopped completely to wait for the rest of his command." This was the closest any of Custer's men came to the river. At that moment, Gall continued. Custer began to realize he was in a dangerous situation. From then on, Custer acted defensively. Others, including Ironhawk and Feather Earring, verified that Custer and his troops did not get any closer to the river than several hundred yards up the coulee. Most of the soldiers remained farther up the hill. Some soldiers shot into the nearly empty Indian camp. The few Indians at Minneconjou Ford returned fire. The earlier sequence of events repeated itself. At first, little impeded the soldiers, but within moments more Indians arrived, and they kept coming, some crossing the river, others approaching from the south on the east side of the river. By the time 15 or 20 Indians had assembled near the ford, the soldiers had paused and then began to ride up out of Medicine Tail Coulee, heading toward higher ground, where they joined the rest of Custer's command. The battle known as the Custer Fight began when the small advance detachment of soldiers approaching the river retreated toward higher ground at approximately 4:15. This would be the last movement the soldiers made on their own initiative. From that point on, every action they took was a response to an escalating Indian assault. As recounted by Indian participants, the fighting followed the natural terrain, and its pace was dictated by the time it took for the Indians to assemble in greater numbers and the relatively brief moments it took for each successive group of soldiers to be killed or forced to retreat. The battle's trajectory formed a sweeping arc, rising from Medicine Tail Coulee across a swale into a hollow known as Deep Coulee, which then opens into a slope leading to Calhoun Ridge, rising further to Calhoun Hill. The battle continued, still ascending, past a depression identified as the Sioux site, and then up to a second rise known as Custer Hill. The high ground from Calhoun Hill to Custer Hill was referred to by the men on the plains as a backbone. From the point where the soldiers pulled back from the river to the lower end of Calhoun Ridge is about 3/4 of a mile, an exhausting 20-minute uphill struggle for a man on foot. Shave Elk, an Oglala in Crazy Horse's band, who ran the distance after his horse was shot at the start of the battle, recalled how tired he became before he reached the top. From the bottom of Calhoun Ridge to Calhoun Hill is another uphill climb of about a 1/4 mile. However, it would be an error to think that all of Custer's force, consisting of 210 men, advanced in a continuous line from one location to another, moving down one coulee, up another, and so forth. Only a small group had approached the river. By the time this unit rejoined the rest, the soldiers had formed a line stretching from Calhoun Hill along the ridge to Custer Hill, a distance of just over half a mile. The uphill route from Medicine Tail Coulee to Deep Coulee, then up the ridge toward Custer Hill, would have been roughly 1.5 miles or slightly more. Red Horse would later state that Custer's troops made 5 separate stands. In each instance, the combat lasted around 10 minutes. It can be thought of as a running fight, with survivors of each clash making their way along the ridge toward Custer at the end. Effectively, the command collapsed inward. According to the native accounts, this phase of the battle began with the scattering of shots near Minneconjou Ford, followed by brief, intense skirmishes at Calhoun Ridge, Calhoun Hill, and the Sioux site, culminating in the death of Custer and his group on Custer Hill, and ending with the pursuit and killing of about 30 soldiers who fled on foot from Custer Hill down a steep ravine toward the river. Meanwhile, on Reno Hill, located just over 4 miles to the south, the soldiers preparing their defenses heard 3 distinct bouts of heavy gunfire, one at 4:25 in the afternoon, about 10 minutes after Custer's men turned back from their approach to Minneconjou Ford, a second about 30 minutes later, and the final burst about 15 minutes after that, which faded out before 5:15. Though the distances were significant, the air was still, and the sound of the 45-55 caliber rounds fired from the cavalry carbines made a loud, thunderous noise. At 5:25, some of Reno's officers, who had ridden out with their men toward the gunfire, saw from Weir Point, a distant hillside, covered with mounted Indians who seemed to be firing at figures on the ground. These Indians were not engaged in battle. They were more likely finishing off the wounded or following the customary practice of delivering a final shot or arrow into a fallen enemy as a sign of victory. Once the fighting commenced, it did not subside, with the last sporadic shots continuing until nightfall. The officers at Weir Point also observed a large movement of Indians, more than any of them had ever seen, heading in their direction. Soon the front lines of Reno's command were exchanging fire with them, prompting the soldiers to retreat quickly back to Reno Hill. As Custer's men made their way from the river toward higher ground, the surrounding land on three sides was quickly filling with Indians, effectively pushing and following the soldiers uphill. We chased the soldiers up a long, gradual slope or hill, away from the river and over the ridge where the battle began. In earnest, said Shave Elk. By the time the soldiers made a stand on the ridge, likely the ridge connecting Calhoun and Custer Hills, the Indians had begun to fill the coulees to the south and east. The officers did their best to keep the soldiers together at this point, said Red Hawk, but the horses became uncontrollable. They would rear up and fall back with their riders. Some managed to escape. Crow King remarked, when they saw they were surrounded, they dismounted. This was cavalry protocol. There was no other way to hold a position or maintain a solid defense. A brief period of fighting on foot followed. As the Native Americans arrived, they dismounted from their horses, sought shelter, and began to approach the soldiers. Using the brush and any small dip or rise in the terrain for cover, they made their way uphill on hands and knees, according to Red Feather. From moment to moment, the Indians would pop up to shoot before quickly dropping down again. Neither side could expose themselves without drawing fire. In battle, the Indians often flattened their feathers to aid in camouflage. It appears the soldiers removed their hats for the same reason. Several Indians later observed soldiers without hats, some dead and others still engaged in the fight. From their position on Calhoun Hill, the soldiers were mounting a coordinated and disciplined defense. When some Indians moved closer, a group of soldiers stood up and charged downhill on foot, pushing the Indians back toward the lower end of Calhoun Ridge. The soldiers then established a standard skirmish line, with each man spaced about 5 yards apart, kneeling to take deliberate aim, as described by Yellow Nose, a Cheyenne warrior. Some Indians observed a second skirmish line, extending perhaps 100 yards along the ridge toward Custer Hill. According to many Indians, it was during the fighting around Calhoun Hill that the Indians suffered the highest casualties, 11 in total. However, soon after the skirmish line was set up on Calhoun Hill, some Indians pressed forward again, moving closer to shooting range of the soldiers on the ridge. Others circled around to the eastern slope of the hill, where they unleashed a heavy, deadly fire on the soldiers guarding the horses. Without their horses, Custer's men were unable to charge or retreat. The loss of the horses also meant losing the saddlebags with their reserve ammunition, about 50 rounds per soldier. As soon as the soldiers on foot had crossed the ridge, Yanktonai warrior Daniel White Thunder later recounted to a white missionary. He and his fellow Indians drove the horses into a panic by waving their blankets and making a terrible noise. "We killed all the men who were holding the horses," Gall said. When a horse holder was shot, the terrified horses would thrash about. "They tried to hold on to their horses," recalled Crow King, "but as we got closer, they let go of their horses." Many soldiers fled down the hill toward the river, adding to the chaos of the battle. Some Indians stopped fighting to chase them. The battle was fierce and bloody, at times fought hand to hand. Men were killed by knives and clubs as well as by gunfire. The Cheyenne Brave Bear witnessed an officer on a sorrel horse shoot 2 Native Americans with his revolver before being killed himself. Brave Bear was able to take the horse. Almost simultaneously, Yellow Nose tore a cavalry guidon from a soldier who had been using it as a weapon. Eagle Elk, caught in the midst of the fighting at Calhoun Hill, saw many men killed or grievously wounded. One Native man was shot through the jaw and was covered in blood. Calhoun Hill was crowded with both Native and white soldiers. At this place, the soldiers stood in line and put up a strong fight, said Red Hawk. However, the soldiers were fully exposed. Many of the men in the skirmish line fell as they knelt. When their line collapsed and retreated up the hill, the entire position was quickly lost. It was at this moment that the Native forces claimed victory. In the moments before, the soldiers had maintained a single, roughly continuous line stretching across the half-mile ridge from Calhoun Hill to Custer Hill. Men had been killed or wounded, but the line remained largely intact. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the soldiers had not yet begun to break. What turned the tide, according to the native warriors, was a sudden and unexpected charge by a large force of mounted natives coming up over the ridge. Many of Crazy Horse's friends and relatives, including He-Dog, Red Feather, and Flying Hawk, witnessed and later described his central role in this attack. Recall that while Reno's men were retreating across the river and up the bluffs, Crazy Horse was heading back toward the center of the camp. He reached the mouth of Muskrat Creek and Medicine Tail Coulee by 4:15, just as the small group of soldiers observed by Gall was pulling back from the river toward higher ground. Flying Hawk later said he followed Crazy Horse down the river past the center of camp. "We came to a ravine," Flying Hawk recalled. "Then we followed up the gulch to a position behind the soldiers holding the hill." From his relatively sheltered position at the ravine's head, Flying Hawk described how Crazy Horse shot them as fast as he could load his gun. This was one form of Sioux warfare. Another was the bold charge. Typically, the transition from one tactic to the other required no long discussion. A warrior simply felt the moment was right. He might shout, "I am going," or he might call out, "Hoka-hey," or let out a war trill or blow a piercing screech through an eagle bone whistle. Red Feather said Crazy Horse's moment came when both sides were crouching and popping up to fire at each other, a standoff situation. "There was a lot of noise and confusion," said Waterman, an Arapaho warrior. "The air was thick with gunpowder smoke, and the Indians were all shouting." Out of this turmoil, said Red Feather, Crazy Horse appeared on horseback, blowing his eagle bone whistle and riding between the two lines of fighters. "Crazy Horse was the bravest man I ever saw," Waterman remarked. "He rode closest to the soldiers, shouting to his warriors. The soldiers shot at him, but he was never hit." After firing at Crazy Horse, the soldiers had to reload. That was when the Indians surged forward and charged. Panic spread among the soldiers. Those gathered near Calhoun Hill were suddenly cut off from those further along the ridge toward Custer Hill, leaving each group vulnerable to the Indians who were attacking on foot and horseback. The soldiers fought to keep their enemies at a distance, aiming to kill from afar. The Sioux, on the other hand, fought with a different instinct, to charge in and engage up close, using quirts, bows, or even their bare hands. There is no fear in battle like the terror of close contact, shouting, hot breath, and the grip of a hand from someone near enough to smell. Crazy Horse's charge brought the Indians into the ranks of the soldiers, where they clubbed and stabbed them to death. The surviving soldiers at the southern end of the ridge now attempted to flee, grabbing horses if they could, or running if they couldn't. "All were heading toward the high ground at the end of the ridge," said the Brule Foolish Elk. The skirmish lines had dissolved. Men crowded together for safety. Iron Hawk noted that the Indians followed closely behind the retreating soldiers. By this time, the Indians were taking the guns and ammunition from the dead soldiers and using them, said Red Hawk. The sharp crack of Springfield carbines rang out from both Indian and white fighters alike. But the killing was mostly one-sided. In the haste of the Calhoun Hill survivors trying to rejoin the rest of the command, the soldiers scattered in a disordered manner, like scattered grain. In the hollow where Captain Miles Keogh's body was discovered, around 20 men's bodies were found pressed together. However, the Indians described no actual battle there, only a relentless rush along the ridge, killing continuously. The line of bodies extended along the ridge. "We circled around them," Two Moons stated, spinning like water around a stone. Another group of the fallen, 10 or more, lay on the slope ascending to Custer Hill. Between this group and the hill, roughly 200 yards away, no bodies were found. The mounted soldiers had raced ahead, leaving the foot soldiers to fend for themselves. Perhaps the 10 who died on the slope were all that remained of the infantry. Perhaps no bodies were discovered in that area because organized fire from Custer Hill held off the Indians while the soldiers scrambled up the slope. Regardless of the reason, most Indian accounts agree that there was a brief lull in the fighting, a moment of repositioning, closing in and creeping forward. The lull was short-lived, offering no time for the soldiers to account for survivors. By this point, half of Custer's men were dead. The Indians were surrounding them. The horses were either dead, wounded, or had fled. There was nowhere to take cover. When the horses reached the top of the ridge, the gray and bay ones mixed together, and the soldiers with them were thrown into confusion, said Foolish Elk. Then he added what no white soldier survived to report. The Indians were so numerous that the soldiers could not go further, and they knew they were going to die. The Indians encircling the soldiers on Custer Hill were soon joined by others from every part of the battlefield, from downriver where they had been pursuing horses, from along the ridge where they had stripped the dead of weapons and ammunition, and from upriver where Reno's men could hear the beginning of the final heavy volley just after 5 o'clock. "There were many of us," said Eagle Bear and Oglala. "Some mounted, others on foot. Back and forth in front of Custer we passed, firing the whole time." Kill Eagle, a Blackfeet Sioux, said the firing came in waves. His interviewer noted that he clapped the palms of his hands together very fast for several minutes to demonstrate the intensity of the firing at its peak, then clapped slower, then faster, then slower again, and finally stopped. In the final phase of the battle, the soldiers killed or wounded very few Indians. As Brave Bear later recalled, "I think Custer realized he was trapped in a bad situation and would have liked to escape if he could, but he was surrounded on all sides and could do nothing but die then." The exact moment of Custer's death remains uncertain. His body was discovered among a group of soldiers near the peak of Custer Hill, surrounded by others within a circle of lifeless horses. It is likely that he fell during the Indians' second, brief, and final charge. Before the assault began, Low Dog, an Oglala warrior, called to his people, "This is a good day to die. Follow me." The warriors surged forward together, a unified mass so close that they could lash each other's horses with their quirts to prevent anyone from lagging behind. Then every chief charged his horse at the white soldiers, and all our warriors did the same, Crow King recalled. In their panic, some soldiers discarded their weapons, raised their hands, and begged to be taken prisoner. However, the Sioux only captured women. Red Horse stated they did not take a single soldier prisoner, but killed them all. The last 40 or so soldiers on foot, with only a handful on horseback, fled downhill toward the river. One of the mounted men wore buckskins. The Indians claimed he fought with a large knife. "His men were all covered in white dust," said Two Moons. These soldiers encountered Indians coming up from the river, including Black Elk. He observed that the soldiers moved strangely. They were making their arms go as if they were running, but they were only walking. They were likely injured, limping, stumbling, throwing themselves forward in a desperate bid to escape. The Indians pursued and killed them all. Oglala warriors brings plenty, and Iron Hawk killed 2 soldiers running up a creek bed, believing they were the last white men to die. Others reported that the final man fled on a swift horse upriver toward Reno Hill, only to inexplicably shoot himself in the head with his own revolver. Yet another account stated that the last man was killed by the sons of the famed Santee warrior, Chief Redtop. However, Two Moons disagreed, claiming that the last man alive was a sergeant, identified by the braids on his shirt, who rode one of the remaining horses in the final rush for the river. He managed to elude his pursuers by rounding a hill and heading back upriver. But just as Two Moons thought he might escape, a Sioux warrior shot and killed him. Of course, none of these last men were the final soldiers to die. That grim distinction went to an unidentified soldier lying wounded on the field. Soon the hill was teeming with Indians, warriors delivering final bullets to the fallen enemies, and women and children who had climbed the long slopes from the village. They joined the warriors who had dismounted to search the dead soldiers' pockets and strip their bodies of clothing. The scene was one of horror. Many of the bodies were mutilated, though in later years the Indians were reluctant to discuss this aspect of the battle. Some said they had seen it, but could not identify who had committed the acts. In the days after the battle, soldiers who crossed the field documented detailed accounts of the mutilations, and illustrations created by Red Horse leave no doubt that they occurred. Red Horse provided one of the earliest Native American perspectives on the battle, and a few years later he created an impressive series of over 40 large drawings depicting the fighting and the dead on the battlefield. Many of these pages focused on fallen Native Americans, each portrayed in their unique attire and headgear. Additional pages depicted the dead soldiers, some fully naked, others partially stripped. Each page showing the white soldiers' corpses featured severed arms, legs, heads, and hands. These mutilations reflected the Native American belief that a person was destined to carry the body they had in this life with them into the afterlife. Revenge was a key element in the Native American sense of justice, and they had long memories. White Necklace, a Cheyenne woman in her mid-50s and wife of Wolf Chief, harbored bitter memories of the massacre at Sand Creek in 1864, where her niece had been killed by whites. When they found her there, her head was cut off, she later recounted. As she approached the hill shortly after the battle had ended, White Necklace encountered the naked body of a fallen soldier. She had an axe at her belt. "I jumped off my horse and did the same to him," she recalled. Many Native Americans said that no one really knew who the leader of the soldiers was until long after the battle. Others, however, claimed there was talk of Custer from the very first day. The Oglala Little Killer, who was 24 at the time, remembered that during the evening's dancing in the large camp, warriors sang Custer's name. Little Killer noted that while no one knew which body was Custer's, they knew he had been there. 60 years later, in 1937, he still remembered a song from that time. Long hair, I was short of guns, and you brought us many. Long hair, I was short of horses, and you brought us many." As late as the 1920s, elderly Cheyennes recounted that 2 Southern Cheyenne women had discovered Custer's body. He had been shot in the head and the side. The women recognized Custer from the Battle of the Washita in 1868 and had seen him up close the following spring when he had come to make peace with Stone Forehead and smoked with the chiefs in the lodge of the Arrow Keeper. There, Custer had vowed never to fight the Cheyennes again, and Stone Forehead, to ensure he kept his word, had poured the ashes from the peace pipe onto Custer's boots, while the general, unaware, sat directly beneath the sacred arrows, which bound him to speak truthfully. It was said that these 2 women were kin to Mona Sita, a Cheyenne girl whose father had been killed by Custer's men at the Washita. Many believed that Mona Sita had been Custer's lover for a time. Regardless of how brief their relationship, it would have been regarded as a marriage according to Cheyenne customs. On the hill at the Little Bighorn, it was told that the 2 Southern Cheyenne women stopped some Sioux men who were about to mutilate Custer's body. "He is a relative of ours," they said. The Sioux men then left. Every Cheyenne woman traditionally carried a sewing awl in a leather sheath adorned with beads or porcupine quills. The awl was used daily for sewing clothing, lodge covers, and most commonly for repairing moccasins. Now the Southern Cheyenne women took their awls and drove them deep into the ears of the man they believed to be Custer. He had ignored Stone Forehead's warning, they said. He had broken his promise to never fight the Cheyennes again. Now, they said, his hearing would be improved.